So Princess Azula is potentially the most badass firebender of all time, and according to many in the community, potentially even the strongest as well. For you see, this blue flame lightning wielding mental patient is the daughter of Firelord Ozai and the granddaughter of Firelord Sozin himself, meaning that right from the very beginning she was set up with the best firebending genes that she could possibly ever get, with potentially the only downside of this being the emotional and in Zuko's case physical abuse. Now sure, she's quick-tempered and ruthless, but she's also incredibly smart, talented, and driven with a desire for power that's so strong it strikes fear in pretty much anyone else around. And her skills in combat strategy are second to none, and in fact so good that she orchestrated the coup in the Earth Kingdom capital Ba Sing Se and even halted the invasion on the Day of the Black Sun. And honestly, if not for her mental instability and her parental issues, she could have truly become one of the greatest benders of all time, with her potential and skill in the art of firebending being borderline limitless. And in fact, to this day, she is the only known firebender to perfect the art to such a high degree that her flames, which would normally be the standard orange colour, are actually blue. Which, while this is just an incredibly cool design choice and something that really displays her as powerful, also comes with a much deeper and almost sadder meaning behind it. For see, these iconic blue flames are believed to be a representation of how hard she has worked to be perfect, given that that's what blue flames essentially are, a more complete form of combustion with less soot within it. Which, to put that in simple terms, just means that the blue flames that we always see her using are a more completely clean and near perfect version of firebending. Which essentially just means that Azula achieved the most perfect form of firebending to ever exist, something which that to this day no avatar or firelord was ever able to do. And honestly, it's just a shame that this search for perfection wasn't for the right reasons, and was something that even towards the end wasn't nearly enough for her, with that final defeat from her brother Zuko tipping her over the edge of sanity and resulting in her having a complete mental breakdown. However, in the comics post-Avatar The Last Airbender, she has shown hints for a desire to control more than just outright destruction, and potentially even some small hints towards a possible redemption. But again, that is truly yet to be seen. Up next we have everyone's favourite hothead, Zuko, the older brother to Azula. Now Zuko of course needs no real explanation, as we've all witnessed him grow from the easily angered child of episode 1 to the man that would eventually become one of the world's greatest fire lords of all time. But now, just for the sake of the video, I'm going to explain and break down everything important about his character and the development that he actually goes through throughout the story, because as many of you are aware, it's potentially the best part of the entire Avatar series as a whole, and the part that I personally enjoyed the most. Now in the beginning, a banished and scarred Zuko would do everything in his power to find and capture Avatar Aang. This was of course to regain the honour and title that was taken from him by his own dad, Firelord Ozai, after he both beat and scarred Zuko in their Agni Kai. Now this obsession with regaining his honour practically consumed his every waking moment, and if it wasn't for his uncle Iroh and the friends that he met along the way, this obsession really could have become the thing that completely finished him off in the end. And then when it comes to Zuko as a character, it's clear as the show develops that this pride and honour that he speaks so passionately about is all just a mask that he uses to cover his self-loathing and resentment that he has for both the man he has become and the man that he wants to live up to. And again, as his journey develops, it eventually transforms from one about regaining honour to one about simply discovering his true self-worth, which I think is a big reason for why many of us resonate with his character so much. Because the learning of one's self-worth is something that almost every single one of us has to do at some point along our own journeys. And it's something that as we watch Zuko do it, eventually becomes clear to us that it is doable, and something that we can also do ourselves. Now sure, none of this would happen for him overnight, nor would any of it be easy, and due to his traumatic past, he was only ever able to see those around him as potential enemies. But like we briefly mentioned before, it was the continued efforts made by Iroh, his future friends, and even the crew that he once led that eventually got him to that place in his life where he was able to put together and come to terms with his own two halves, the quote-unquote good and bad sides of who he was. Now I can just go on and on about Zuko's journey for hours on end, but we have so many firebenders on this list to explain, so I just simply don't have the time to do so. But who knows, down the line I might just dedicate an entire video to Zuko's redemption and his entire story, because as I'm sure you can tell, I have a lot to say about it. But now later in life, after he defeated Azula and became the Fire Lord, he would go on to reconnect with his mother and his own half-sister Kiyi, before then helping Aang to manage the tensions between benders and non-benders alike, which even to this day has proven to be something that is easier said than done. He would then aid Korra in her protection against the Red Lotus, as well as go on to lead the Fire Nation into a time of peace and prosperity, before eventually relinquishing his title to his daughter Izumi, for the sole reason as to prevent a possible conflict or fight over said title, which is actually, when you think about it, a very mature thing to do, and something I'm sure Iroh would most definitely be very proud of him for doing. Up next on the list, it's Fire Lord Sozin himself, the man who began the 100-year war and all but wiped airbending off the map completely. Now Sozin of course was the ruler of the Fire Nation in 58 BG, all the way until he peacefully died in his sleep in 20 AG, which honestly, given the things that he did during his lifetime, kind of annoys me, because if there's one guy who deserved to be tortured to death, it was most definitely this guy. Like, he committed a mass genocide on an entire nation, and he gets a peaceful death in his sleep? Like, come on, what are we doing here? But now Sozin wasn't always this big bad ruler who wanted everyone who wasn't his own dead, and in fact in much of his early life he was a fairly good-hearted individual, with even the fire avatar Roku himself considering him a dear friend. And in fact it wouldn't be until he became the Fire Lord that his desires for power and world domination would begin to show. However, in the beginning Avatar Roku soon put an end to this and completely humiliated him inside his own kingdom. However, this wouldn't put an end to it and only served to grow his resentment and thirst for power, to the point that when he was presented with the choice to save his dear friend or just let him die, he chose the latter, because this would of course serve his desires for world domination far better than if he was to live. Now after this, he would begin what would become a century-long war against pretty much the entire world, by almost completely wiping the air nomads off the map. But then at some point in time, between the destruction of the air temples and his death, he would also go about making the dragons themselves completely extinct, as well as making it completely illegal to enter any sort of same-sex relationship while inside the Fire Nation. And the reason behind this was due to his hatred for his sister Sozin, who at this point had become known for having a number of relationships with women of all kinds. Now of course, like I said, he would go on to die peacefully in his sleep, which like I said was completely undisturbed. And after this brief explanation, I'm sure you think the same thing. This guy's a total psychopath and deserved the worst death imaginable. But now with that said, up next we have Commander Zhao, or as he later became, Admiral Zhao. Now Zhao is someone who in his introduction came across as a dangerous and important individual, but later down the line of course just transformed into a bit of a tit. He was trained by the renowned firebender Jeong Jeong, and became one of the Fire Nation's most trusted by climbing the ranks of Lieutenant, Captain, Commander, and eventually Admiral. And as one of the most powerful men in the Fire Nation, or so he claims, took it upon himself to finally do what no other seemingly could, that is, capturing Avatar Aang. Now of course this didn't work out the way he had wanted, but it's because of this that Zhao became a major enemy to Aang's Avatar team. That was until we reached the siege of the Northern Water Tribe, where he was eventually killed by the Moon Spirit out of revenge for him killing the Ocean Spirit, which also subsequently condemned him to spend eternity in the Fog of the Lost Souls, where it appears he lost what was left of his fragile mind. Quickly moving on, next we have the most beloved character in the entire Avatar universe, Uncle Iroh, aka the Dragon of the West. Now like his grandkids Azula and Zuko, he needs no real explanation, but because he's potentially the best character in not only Avatar but all forms of fiction, I'm going to give him one anyway. So Uncle Iroh was a retired Fire Nation general and a former crown prince of the nation, before the death of his son and the banishment of his nephew made him denounce his role as the crown prince and venture out to protect and raise Zuko as if he was his own. And during his time as a general in the Fire Nation, he earned his title of the Dragon in the West by using his well-known ability to breathe fire to slay what was believed to be the last dragon on Earth, which just goes to present him as one dangerous old man. Now later in life he would go on to become a Grand Lotus in the Order of the White Lotus, which is an ancient and formerly secret society that transcends the boundaries of the four nations, seeking only philosophy, beauty, and truth in the world of Avatar. But now as a character, Iroh is so much more than just titles and abilities, and for many of us, including Zuko himself, was the voice of reason and wisdom, as well as the literal definition of what true masculinity should look like. For see, unlike many stereotypical tough guys, Iroh shows that real courage is not just in fighting, but in protecting, healing, and guiding others. And it just can't be understated the quiet strength, emotional intelligence, and moral clarity that he had within him. And these are all aspects and examples of Iroh's character that we should all try to live up to each and every day of our lives. And I also think it's fair to say that until the end of time, Iroh will be remembered as potentially the greatest character to ever exist. But again, I find myself just rambling on about some of my favourite characters, so let's just quickly move on ahead. Up next, let's discuss Iroh's late son, Liu Ten, who was actually the second in line to the Fire Nation throne back when he was alive. Now he was apparently a very compassionate and thoughtful person, which really isn't all that surprising given that he was Iroh's only born son. Now Liu Ten was also the one that actually introduced Iroh to the Jasmine Islands' famous golden tea known as Jasmine Tea, which subsequently became Iroh's favourite brew and the drink that we see him drinking throughout the entire story. Now Liu Ten later joined the military to both serve his nation as well as to help anyone he possibly could along the way. But after witnessing the horrors of the 100-year war, Liu Ten began to question the direction his nation was taking, and one day while serving his nation in combat as a soldier, he sadly died. This was during one of the attacks on Ba Sing Se during his father's 600-day siege. Now Liu Ten's death would actually go on to play a massive part in the coming story, as now his grieving father, like we previously mentioned, abandoned the siege altogether and ultimately his place as the crown prince, which perfectly provided Ozai an opportunity to usurp his birthright as the Fire Lord of his nation, which I don't know about you, but begins to make me question if this wasn't all put in place by Ozai himself, and if the death of Liu Ten wasn't somehow part of Ozai's master plan. But again, that's never directly stated or proven to be the case. It's just something that I really wouldn't put past him. Up next, we have Iroh once again. only this time it's Zuko's own grandson, who was named after the man who raised Zuko into the fine man that he is today. Now General Iroh is the son of Fire Lord Izumi, who is the daughter of Fire Lord Zuko. He is a firebending master and a skilled military leader, and in fact was named the youngest general in the Fire Nation's history. However, he would later leave the Fire Islands and volunteer to serve in the Northern Water Tribe's own military fleet, which earned him considerable respect and many useful skills in the process. However, after completing his service in the Northern Water Tribe, he joined the United Forces and rose to the position of general, where he then would go on to play a crucial role in the Battle of Republic City and the Unalaq Crisis, as well as also helping to aid Korra during the Earth Empire invasion of the United Republic. Now, Iroh went on to be well respected and described as a disciplined and determined man who was completely unwilling to give up without any sort of a fight, which honestly just makes him, in my opinion, the perfect man to carry on the great name of Iroh. Now up next, let's quickly discuss Zuko's own daughter and young General Iroh's mother, Izumi, who I should point out is never specifically mentioned to be a firebender. But given that bending is normally a gene passed from parent to child, and the fact that we have no clue on who her mother actually is widely believed that because Zuko's family holds such a strong connection to bending itself, that she also must be a firebender like the others we have mentioned. So with that being the case, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the kind of woman and Fire Lord that she turned out to be. Now Izumi, of course, was the Fire Lord after Zuko, who ascended the throne in 167 AG, following her father's decision to step down as the nation's ruler. She was a calm, patient person, and someone who was very aware of the dark history that she had inherited. But now this didn't mean that she was completely opposed to any sort of aggression, and in fact often used it in times when she felt it necessary to get her way. She was often considered wise beyond her years and completely driven towards a goal of developing the Fire Nation's cultural identity to something beyond just imperialism. Oh, and it is also worth mentioning that as of right now, she is the only known Fire Lord to ever exist in the world of Avatar, which you can't lie is just kinda cool and a true testament to the kind of character she must have presented to Zuko and her people. Quickly moving on, however, up next we have another Fire Lord on the list, and potentially the strongest Fire Lord and Firebender to ever exist. It's Fire Lord Ozai, the grandfather to Izumi and father to both Zuko and Azula. Now Fire Lord Ozai, aka the Phoenix King, is up there with Sozin in terms of brutality and bastardly treatment of others. He was an abusive parent and husband, and a man responsible for the deaths of millions around the world. But he's also, in my opinion, extremely underrated, and someone who actually deserves much more credit as a bender than he currently gets. Because while sure, he's an unredeemable psychopath, I ain't saying otherwise, he's still somebody who's potentially the strongest firebender there's ever been, and likely to ever be again. For see, he had the potential to go toe-to-toe with Avatar Aang himself, who, while not a full master of all the elements, was still proficient in each and every single one of them. Meaning for someone like Ozai to even stand a chance or to come as close as he possibly did to defeating him with just one element alone just shows how skillful he really was in that art of firebending. Like, see, this was a guy who bent fire and lightning at the same time, while still fending for his life against the Avatar himself. But for some reason, many in the community still consider him weaker than Azula and even Iroh. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Iroh. I just don't think he holds a candle to the destructive power that Ozai has. But now without turning this into a power scaling debate, I want to just touch on Ozai's character before moving on to the rest of the firebenders that we have to explain. So Ozai himself was a power-hungry and abusive individual who was easily angered and lacked even an ounce of empathy whatsoever, with even his brother Iroh himself pointing out that in his entire life he never once regretted, forgave, or changed his mind about anything at all, believing morality as a whole to be a sign of weakness and found peace and kindness just straight up laughable. Which in my opinion just made him the perfect main antagonist for someone like Aang to face. Because as you're likely all aware, that is the exact opposite of what Aang himself represents. Now during Ozai's time as Fire Lord, we saw a mass build-up of both industry and scientific advancement, with some of the world's greatest minds being placed together by him to create the beginnings of what would later become cars, planes, and even robots, presenting that which we already know, that in times of war, technology really does advance faster than any other time of the year. Now he also would go on to use his power and rule to attempt to finish what Sozin had started, the 100-year-long war to conquer each and every other nation to become the supreme ruler of the world. However, before his plans could come to fruition, he was defeated by Avatar Aang, who also subsequently used his energy bending to remove Ozai's bending altogether, resulting in him becoming what he hated most in the entire world, a non-bender. Now following this, he was then sentenced to life in prison on account of the many, and I mean many, war crimes that he committed during his time as the Fire Lord. Up next, we have Master Jeong Jeong, also known as the Deserter. Now Jeong Jeong was a strong, enlightened, yet resentful firebending master who was once an honored admiral of the Fire Nation Navy, before he eventually became disillusioned with his nation's mistreatment of others, which led him to the decision to defect from the military altogether, with it being said that he was actually the first to ever do so and survive, which is exactly what gained him the title of the Deserter. He would later relocate to the Earth Kingdom, where he eventually encountered and attempted to train Avatar Aang, although as we all saw, that didn't go exactly to plan. Now much later after he joined the Order of the White Lotus, he used the power of Sozin's Comet to help liberate Ba Sing Se from the Fire Nation's control, before from what we can gather after the war returning to the Earth Kingdom and reunited with the small tribe of people that he met before Aang. Up next we have Yun-Ra, one of Avatar's most hated firebenders of all time. Now Yun-Ra was the commanding officer of the Southern Raiders, who served during the final stages of the Southern Water Tribe raids, and was also the same man that was responsible for Sokka and Katara's mother Kaya being unfortunately killed in an unsuccessful attempt to eliminate the last of the Southern Water Tribe's waterbenders. Now following his retirement 2 years after this event, he would only reappear in the story due to Katara's wish to have her revenge against him. Although after he offered his own mother's life to save his own, Katara realized how worthless a human being he really was, and that by killing him she would only be dishonoring both herself and the memory of her mother. So she spared him, and from what we can gather, he went back to living out what was left of his miserable life at home with his mother. Next up we have the OG Combustion Bender, who was given the name of Combustion Man by none other than Sokka himself. Now Combustion Man was a firebending assassin and a silent bounty hunter that was hired by Prince Zuko to track down and eliminate Avatar Aang. He followed Aang and his team throughout the Fire Nation and terrorized them with his unique style of firebending, known later as combustion bending, which basically worked to allow him to project and detonate large explosions using his third eye tattoo that was placed upon his forehead. Now later it was revealed that rumors say that Combustion Man was a Fire Nation soldier injured in battle, where after he underwent intense healing through the use of experimental techniques, he gained the ability to firebend using his mind, which of course, like we said a moment ago, became the power known as combustion bending. Now after 3 nearly successful attempts at ending Aang's life, Combustion Man tracked the team down to the Western Air Temple, where he then continued to unleash enormous explosions and destruction everywhere he went. However, after his third eye was later hit by Sokka's boomerang, he unintentionally unleashed a massive point-blank explosion that resulted in his own death. However, this wouldn't mark the end of combustion bending entirely, as the next firebender on our list actually replicated the same ability to an even higher degree than he was able to do. This character was of course Pli, the firebending criminal who, like we just said, possesses combustion bending. Now Pli was a lifelong member of the Red Lotus and a faithful follower and lover to Sahir, who after being freed from 13 years in prison, she helped in what would become an unsuccessful attempt to rid the world of all governments and avatars. Now in doing this, they threw the Earth Kingdom into anarchy and tracked Avatar Korra to the top of Lagima's peak, where she would then later sadly die, in a fairly similar way to that of Combustion Man. You see, it was during this battle on top of Lagima's peak that Suyin Beifong metal bent her own chest plate around Pli's head, causing one of her combustion attacks to explode in a confined space, which of course, like I said, resulted in her own death. Up next we have Mako, the firebender that was a part of Avatar Korra's Team Avatar. Now Mako was a firebender from a multicultural family of both earth and firebenders, who alongside his brother Bo Lin was forced to grow up on the streets of Republic City, after both his father and mother were killed when he was little more than just a boy. Now he'd go on to form a pro-bending team with his brother, and aspired for this new career to bring him fame and fortune. However, this would soon change when he met Avatar Korra, who joined this team and eventually became a loyal friend, lover, and ex. Now much later, he would join Korra in her efforts to stop the Equalists, and in the following months joined the Republic City's very own police force, where he steadily rose up the ranks to the position of detective. He'd then later join the others in their efforts to stop Unlock and Fatu during the Humana Convergence, and then again aided Korra's Team Avatar in the defeat of the Red Lotus as well as the defeat of Kuvira, before then eventually going back to work as a detective of Republic City, where from what we know of, he stayed for the rest of his life. But hopefully in Avatar 7 Havens we get some more detail on this and we can know for certain where he actually went after the Legend of Korra, because I for one would really like to know. Now quickly moving on, up next we have Firelord Azulan, who was the son of Firelord Sozin and the father of both Firelord Ozai and dear old Uncle Iroh. Now Azulan was of course the ruler of the Fire Nation for a majority of the 100-year war, and was assigned the role in Firelord from 20 AG until his assassination by his own son Ozai in 95 AG. Now it is said that during his reign he managed to take over a massive amount of territorial conquests, as well as nearly bring about the destruction of the entire Southern Water Tribe. Now later, when Ozai of course went to him about being crowned the rightful heir to the throne, he ordered Ozai to kill his firstborn as punishment for his insult. However, Ozai would go about disobeying this order and actually had Azulan himself assassinated by his daughter-in-law Ursa, which is probably about the only nice thing that he ever actually did for Zuko, even if it was in the end just to suit his own gain. Moving on, up next we have Kiyi, Ursa's daughter and Azula and Zuko's half-sister. Now Kiyi was the daughter of Ursa and Norin, and a child that was born following Ursa's exile from the Fire Nation capital. She initially grows up in Hira, ignorant of her connection to the royal family. This was however until much later when her mother was found by Zuko, where she then learned about him and her place in the Fire Nation. She'd then later play a major part in the Kimurikage crisis, when she was of course kidnapped along with several other children by conspirators. However, she'd later free herself and the other hostages by use of her latent firebending abilities, which were actually so strong in this first use that she melted an entire metal door. Like, let me say that again. This was her first time ever firebending at the age of only 6 years old, and she was able to melt a metal door. Like, can you imagine what this child will be able to do when she's properly trained? Up next we have Hei-Ran, the firebending master who taught Avatar Kuruk everything he knew about bending fire. Now, after spending a couple of years to make Kuruk a fully mastered firebender, she went her separate ways from the Avatar, and in 316 BG, which was a total of 4 years after Kuruk's death, she married a man named Junsik. She then went on to give birth to a daughter named Rangi, who would go on to teach Kyoshi the art of firebending just like her mother did for Avatar Kuruk before her. Now, after making Kyoshi into a firebending master, she would then go on to settle in Jasmine Island, for what is believed to be the rest of her life. Up next, we have the character that we just briefly mentioned, Rangi. Now, Rangi started out as the bodyguard to Yun, before eventually becoming the friend, teacher, and eventual lover of Kyoshi herself. Now, down the line, after the two would eventually run away together, they would find themselves in a final confrontation against their former friend, Yun, where she would actually wind up getting stabbed by him. However, despite this terrible wound, she was actually healed by Avatar Kyoshi herself. Following this, they defeated Yun and went on to settle in Ba Sing Se, where Rangi is believed to have stayed for quite some time, while also assisting Kyoshi in whatever Avatar duties she needed along the way. Now next, we have another Avatar teacher by the name of Yim, who is actually in fact Avatar Korra's firebending master when she was still just a child. Now Yim was hard-headed and firm, and from day one never took it easy on Korra at all, considering it necessary for the Avatar to be able to learn and adapt to his style of teaching. Now, as time would go on and progress slowed down, they would grow to hate each other and frustrations would grow within their class. However, despite all this, years later in 170 AG, when Yim oversaw Korra's firebending test, she demonstrated that all her time with him and his teachings never actually went to waste, when she defeated 3 whole firebenders single-handedly with very little effort, to which Yim then warned her not to get ahead of herself as they have not yet decided if she's even passed this test at all. Up next, we have the Shaman, who is a firebender who lived among the Banti on Banti Island, which is actually a remote island located in the southern Fire Nation. Here she tended to her connection to the spirits, which she later used to sense dark spirits emerging from the harmonic convergence. She would then go on to later use her spiritual powers to heal the amnesiac Avatar Korra, before of course giving her one of her bisons to then go and save the day once again. Now next, we have the Sun Warriors and their chief. Now, Sun Warriors are an ancient civilization who first discovered firebending from the dragons themselves, and over time became the keepers and protectors of the last remaining few that still existed in the world. They exist in isolation but are considered by many to be fairly formidable, given that they've mastered the art of true firebending. That is something that only those who watched and learned from the dragons themselves is said to be able to do. As for the Sun Warrior chief, well, he was the head of the Sun Warriors for the last 20 years, with his main goals being the protection of his tribe and his people, as well as the well-being of the dragons Ran and Shaw. And in fact, he took his Sun Warrior philosophy so seriously that he wouldn't lighten up at all until the masters themselves had deemed Aang and Zuko worthy of their respect. At which point he showed that lighter side of himself and began to joke with the two about keeping them locked up forever because of what they now know. Moving on, up next we have the dragons themselves, which even though there's like 5 of them that we know of, I'm just going to compile them all into this one section. So to start us off, the dragons themselves were thought to be completely wiped out and made extinct by Sozin and his firebending army. But later on into the show, we meet both Ran and Shaw, 2 ancient dragons revered by the Sun Warriors as the original masters of firebending, and the 2 dragons that at the end of the 100-year-long war were considered to be the last surviving dragons in the entire world. Now, over the years, however, these 2 dragons were visited by many people throughout history, with only a small few of them ever being considered worthy. And in the chance of you being deemed unworthy, they would completely destroy you, with it being said that not even your bones would survive the attack. They would of course go on to teach Aang and Zuko the true way of firebending before retreating back into their lair. Now much later, after the 100-year-long war, Ran and Shaw had at least one descendant that we know of, named Druk, who eventually went on to become Fire Lord Zuko's very own pet dragon. Now Druk and Zuko, a lot like Appa and Aang, would grow inseparable, and he would carry Zuko throughout each and every one of his many battles, and it is believed that he had done so until the day of Zuko's death. Now as for Roku's own dragon named Fang, well, he was a lot like Zuko's dragon Druk, in the way that he led him into many fights and stayed with him even in his own death. And in fact, Fang can be seen with Roku in the spirit world, demonstrating that his loyalty and devotion towards the Avatar was so deep that even death couldn't keep them apart. Now finally, we have the Green Dragon, who was a female dragon that lived around the beginning of the 100-year-long war. Now see, this dragon made her nest in the high mountains located in the Fire Nation, and eventually at some point laid an egg, to which a group of poachers obtained a map leading them straight to it. However, after another map had been located by Avatar Aang and Kuzan, the poachers eventually had no choice but to run away, leaving the Green Dragon to think that Avatar Aang was in fact the one hunting the egg, which then led her to knocking the egg out of his hands and nearly destroying it. However, after Aang managed to catch the egg before it hit the ground, she was convinced that he was there to help the egg, not to hurt it. And although she was incredibly grateful to him, she still refused to take either of them on a ride like Kuzan had hoped. Now that of course does it for all the important firebenders in the Avatar world. But now there are some less important characters that we really couldn't be arsed explaining, so I'm just going to name them here and then sign off for the day. So the less important characters that we couldn't be arsed explaining are the Fire Sages, the Great Sage, the Agni Kai Triad, Tuto Ping, Jaya, Naoki, Tamin, and of course the Warden of the Prison. All are side characters or just names that were mentioned along the way, and characters that while they can bend fire, just aren't important enough to explain in this video. So again, with that said, that's going to do it for me and this one. I really hope you enjoyed, and hit that like button and subscribe button down below. And if nothing else, just have a great day or night wherever you are, and peace.